maximize the time we have together. My name is Karen Westerfield Tucker. I'm on the faculty here and I teach in the area of worship. I'm also the co-secretary of the International Commission, the dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the World Methodist Council. Welcome. It's very unusual to have a drafting group of any international commission in a city. This week we have two. And it is my pleasure to introduce first the members of the Consultation Commission for the Roman Catholic Church and the World Evangelical Alliance. First I introduce the co-chair, Rolf Hiller. Co-chair on the Catholic side, Don Bolin.
That's fine, who's most of the co-chair on that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Other members of the World Evangelical Alliance, say
Joel Lalowski.
And Don Bolin.
Don Bolin. From the World Methodist Roman Catholic Dialogue, Methodist co-chair David Chapman. Other members, say who you are.
John Sherrington, I'm on the Catholic side, Bishop from London.
Edgardo Colonna Meric, on the Methodist side, I teach theology at Duke.
Claire Watkins, I'm a Catholic, I don't take sides.
Tony Clara, I work at the Pontifical Council for Christian Unity, so I'm co-secretary of Dialogue with Karen, and I'm Catholic.
Welcome all of you. What I propose we do this evening is hear from different persons representing these two dialogues, and then the bulk of the time turn over to questions that you have about the work of these various groups, about the work of dialogues in general, or questions that you may have about the World Evangelical Alliance or the Roman Catholic Church and the Pontifical Council, or even the World Methodist Council. You may have questions about those bodies. So first I'll turn to David Chapman. Say a little bit more about yourself, David, and say something about the background for the dialogue and where we're working at today.
Thank you very much, Karen, for the introduction to us. If I may say, first of all, I'm absolutely delighted to be in Boston, standing to get the green line yesterday evening. I have never been so cold in my entire life. I had no idea that wind could be so penetrating despite several layers. But it's really good to be here in Boston. I am a Methodist, a presbyter, an elder of the Methodist Church in Britain, a superintendent minister, which means I have oversight of several churches and ministerial colleagues. I've served on our joint commission for dialogue between the World Methodist Council and the Roman Catholic Church for the past 14 years, and now I have the distinct honour of being the Methodist co-chair. It is work that began in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council. Remember the name of Albert Outler, who was for many years academic at Southern Methodist University, prior to that at Duke and at Yale. And Albert Outler was one of two of the permanent official Methodist observers at the Second Vatican Council. And it had a profound influence on him, his experience of attending the council sessions. He was very faithful in attending council sessions, so much so that it was often thought that they wouldn't begin until he had taken his place in the observers' gallery. He then inspired particularly United Methodists to respond positively to an invitation from the Vatican to appoint an international dialogue commission. And that began at the same time as the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, ARCI, which is much more well known internationally. But the Methodist Catholic Dialogue Commission, as I say, began in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council and has been meeting ever since. We report in 5-yearly cycles to coincide with the 5-yearly meetings of the World Methodist Council. The atmosphere following Vatican II was one of great optimism that ecumenism was on the verge of major breakthroughs. And so the early years were marked by a sense of optimism as traditions that had previously had very little to do with one another, discovered that actually they perhaps had more in common than had been supposed. So the dialogue has progressed through a number of phases. Shall we say 3 main phases? Firstly, a getting to know you phase, an introductory phase of the first 10 years in which outline convergence was quickly established across a whole range of theological topics. Then a middle phase of dialogue in which specific topics were dealt with that gave some theological foundations for future dialogue. So there was a focus on the church, a focus on the apostolic tradition, a focus then on the nature of revelation and faith. And moving on to a third phase of dialogue, which was to progress in more detail aspects of ecclesiology, the church and sacraments. Remember that in international conversations ecumenically there are different currents going on at the same time, which often feed into one another. And so the BEM process of the World Council of Churches discussing baptism, Eucharist and ministry had a knock-on effect for the Arctic dialogue and for the Methodist Catholic dialogue in particular. And so ecclesiology became a third phase of the dialogue. We are now, I think, taking stock of that, allowing this work to be received more widely within the World Methodist family and within the Catholic Church. And we are looking at a basic topic of fundamental importance to the Christian life. And that is the nature of grace and holiness. Because it is grace and holiness that lies at the very centre of what it means to be a Christian, a follower of Jesus Christ. So that is what we are presently working on in our dialogue. Because it's international, we meet in different places, which can sound terribly exotic. When I say I have been to Vienna, what I mean is I arrived on a Friday evening after dark at the airport, was taken to a monastery outside of Vienna where we met, and the following Friday morning, early before it got light, I was taken back to the airport. So I've been to Vienna, but I haven't seen very much of it at all. But of course that's what it's like when you are engaged in dialogue. We meet as a group of theologians, humanists, pastors. We engage in theological conversation, but we're also engaged in what I would call spiritual ecumenism, whereby the encounter that we are engaged in is much more than simply a theological conversation drawing on our respective dogmatic traditions. It's a holistic encounter. We worship together, begin our working day with prayer. We also participate in our respective celebration of the Eucharist, but respecting the disciplines of our churches, so that we experience the pain of what it is to be separated in the body of Christ. If we were to ignore that, we would be saying that such differences do not matter. But they do matter, and it's important that theologically we are able to get as great a convergence and agreement in faith so that we can then proceed to a deepening fellowship or communion in the body of Christ. So there's a mixture of joy in our sharing together and the pain of the separation that exists. I think I've probably spoken for long enough, so I'll hand back to Karen. We can then move on.
Thank you. Professor Hiller, say something about who you are and your work here.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation, and I like to be here in Boston again. I've been here and walked the Freedom Trail, and I was always thrilled of the history of the United States, and I hope the British will forgive me for that. Well, I come from Germany, and I'm throughout my professional life, I mainly was teaching as a theologian in systematic theology and practical theology, and was involved in many ways with the Evangelical Alliance, also for 20 years in the executive committee of the Theological Commission of the World Evangelical Alliance, 14 years as a chairman, and since 2008 I was appointed as Director for Ecumenical Affairs. And in this capacity I had different ecumenical dialogues or conversations. First with the Adventist Church, the question was how Adventists can join national alliances, and then since 2009 the conversation with theologians from the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. And I'm very, very happy to have this chance, and I can just underline what you have said. It's not only theological discussion, it's also a spiritual experience to meet people from a different tradition and see how the Holy Spirit works in the Catholic Church. And there are tremendous developments, mainly of course in the Second Vatican Council. The story between the World Evangelical Alliance and the Catholic Church was complicated in the past. In 1986 it was for the first time that during a General Assembly of the World Evangelical Alliance, 2 Catholic bishops were invited to greet the General Assembly, and the reaction of some Italians and Latin Americans and Spanish evangelicals was that they will withdraw their membership in the WEA if this happens again. And then there was the insight that we need a kind of dialogue to interact and to learn more about each other. And from that time on, there were some conversations regularly in the past, first on mission, second on the understanding of the New Testament word of koinonia and fellowship, and perhaps this might be a platform for evangelicals and Catholics to find things to do together. And now we have this series of dialogues, and first that was very important for me to start with convergences in terms of dogmatical foundations, and I think it is very, very important that we have a high understanding of scriptures as the inspired word of God in both traditions, and then the creeds of the old church, which we share, and also a good deal of the tradition of the early church and the church fathers and so on. So this is a good fundament, and we know all that these Christian convictions are tested by the modern world and the modernity, and therefore I think we have a common ground. And also in terms of ethics, there is in all Western countries at least this strong debate on bioethics, on medical ethics with abortion, euthanasia today. These are many questions, and Christians are, in the West at least, in a minority with these issues, and so I think it's important that evangelicals and Catholics stand together also in the political arena to give witness in these areas of ethical challenges. But we also dealt with questions of divergences, which means we had the issue of scripture and tradition, and to learn and understand what is meant by tradition in this context, not every tradition, but according to Vincent von Florinus, what is believed everywhere and from the very beginning by all. And this is a special understanding of tradition. And what does it mean to refer to scriptures? You see from many evangelicals regard all the tradition in the Catholic Church beyond scriptures, all things that are not directly, can be directly drawn from the Bible, they regard it as heretical. And this is one of the questions we have to deal with and to ponder in an adequate way. So this has been a good deal of our conversation. And then as a second issue, the role of the Church in salvation. There has been this joint declaration between the Lutheran World Federation and the Catholic Church on justification, and I really believe that in terms of works and grace, there has been a good deal of progress in the past, but there is still the question of the ordination of the priesthood and the bishop's ordination and the spiritual power in terms of the sacraments of the Eucharist, etc. So these are still burning issues, and we try to find a deeper understanding. And what horrified me from the evangelical side is to see how deep the prejudice in the evangelical movement are mainly in evangelical circles with a Catholic majority. There's still a lot of resistance. They have some historical wounds and traumata and so on. And the question is how we can overcome this. And on the other hand, I really want to lead these evangelical friends to a better understanding. And now, since Vatican II, there has changed a lot, and we have to say that the Roman Catholic Church has had excellent popes in the past, and so we are very happy about that. I was happy to hear that Josef Ratzinger became Benedict XVI. I heard him as a student in Tübingen when he was professor there, and later on I did some radio programs with him, and he's an excellent theologian who knows about the challenges of modernity. And now Pope Francis, who is really very open and in some of his attitudes seems to be evangelical. And therefore, some evangelicals are irritated. They say always, the Pope cannot be a Christian like that. But he is. And so, yes, we have to introduce them to the reality, and I hope we will do some good progress. Thank you.
Thanks. It's very good to be with you here this evening. I have the privilege of working with both of these dialogues. With David, I'm a Roman Catholic co-chair of the Methodist Catholic Dialogue, relatively recently, filling in for an Australian Bishop, Michael Putney, who took ill and had to step down. And I'm on the Evangelical Roman Catholic Consultation, and I'm a drafter on that. Like your shirts, I'm from Canada. You think of the border between North Dakota and Montana, Canadian border, and then go up about 300 miles, you get to the city of Saskatoon. I have to say that it was about 12 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in Saskatoon than it is in This is not normal. I thought I'd say a word about the methodology that the two dialogues use and some of the breakthroughs that we've come to in terms of method, which I think will be a good opening point for yourselves. with the Methodist Roman Catholic dialogue, I guess with all ecumenical conversations in the past 50 years, we've struggled with the reception of the documents. If there's something that's shown to be predictable, it's that when you bring two groups of Christians together and you mandate them to seek reconciliation with the dialogue partner, beautiful things happen, right? I mean, friendships are established, a context is created which is as conducive as possible to reconciliation. And so inevitably, those dialogues map out convergences, sometimes consensus, and they put the differences or divergences into a new context. And that almost always happens in bilateral dialogue groups. And the group of dialogue participants become a trusted group of friends who are faithful to their own traditions, but seeking the reconciliation that Christ desires. And you do definitely have an experience of being empowered by the Holy Spirit in these dialogues. Now, because of the problem with reception, that people who read our documents, our agreed statements, our dialogue reports, don't have the experience, right? They get the document, they get the paper, and they measure those agreements over and against their tradition and what it says. And they look for the same formulations, they look for their tradition to be clearly recognized. And because there isn't the experience of encounter behind it, often those agreed statements do not achieve the kind of breakthroughs in terms of our relations that we who serve on those commissions believe they could. So that's the challenge or problem of ecumenical reception. How do we engage our whole churches somehow to draw more closely together through this dialogue process and beyond it? With the Methodist Roman Catholic dialogue, a document that was produced in 2006 called The Grace Given You in Christ made a step. It, like its previous documents, as David was saying, it mapped out convergence. The subject was the church. It mapped out what we could say in common about the church, areas where we still experience tension. But it took a new step in the last chapter, which David co-authored, quite a beautiful work. It asked about the exchange of gifts. It said, it was one of the rare occasions that Methodists and Catholics met separately, because we almost always meet together. As both speakers have said, there's a spiritual dimension to our meetings, and we don't spend a lot of time meeting separately. But the Catholics got together, the Roman Catholics, the Methodists got together, and each asked, what are the gifts that we'd like to receive from the dialogue partner? And what are the gifts that we hope we could share with the dialogue partner? And in that last chapter, we worked through the subject areas that were treated in the earlier part of the document, and in each area said, what are the gifts we would like to receive from the dialogue partner? What are the resources? So we spoke about, of course, Wesleyan hymns, for instance, but synodal processes within Methodism. And it was intended as a way of trying to draw the readership into the implications of our agreements. Those of you who would have studied ecumenism will know the Lund principle back in 1952, that we should do all things together except for deep differences require that we act separately. But the truth is, we tend to act separately except where extraordinary circumstances force us to act together. So this dialogue was trying to move us towards reception on the areas where we had mapped out convergence or consensus. And then they produced a summary document looking at all of the themes that had been addressed in the 35 or 40 years of dialogue at that point, and tried to put it forward to our communities to say, look what we've achieved in these 40 years of conversation. With the Evangelical Roman Catholic dialogue, as Professor Gila has said, we're working on a couple of difficult theological topics, which have traditionally been points of difference between evangelicals and Catholics. the relationship between Scripture and tradition, the role of tradition, and the role of the church in salvation. And what we've tried to do, and in some sense, what we're trying to do in a history of antagonism between our communities is act in a very Christian way towards each other. We've tried to map out in each section, so regarding Scripture, regarding tradition, and then regarding the relationship between the two, regarding the role of the church in salvation, what can we say in common? What is our common faith? And we map that out as rigorously as we can, turning to the Scriptures, our ancient common traditions, our common sources. And then instead of saying, which would be the normal tack, we agree on those things, but here are the lingering problems. We've asked two questions. Firstly, where are we encouraged by what we see in the dialogue partner? Where are we encouraged by what we see in the dialogue partner? And then, what are the questions that we'd still want to ask the dialogue partner when all is said and done? And when we are asking these questions, we're trying to bring our readership, who are much more suspicious of the dialogue partner, trying to bring our readership along. So we're trying to say, regarding the assurance of salvation, for instance, despite what we hold in common, we would still want to ask a question. But before we ask that question, we would want to say, we used to think you believed that, but we've come to understand that you don't believe that anymore. We used to think you understood X, but now we understand that you interpret it this way, not that way. But still, we want to ask you this question. It's a way of trying to bring those who are not so open to new insights in our relations to come along with us. I think we kind of stumbled upon that method, that process, a year ago when this drafting meeting took place in Rome. We had a beautiful evening where we talked about the assurance of salvation. We started asking each other questions. Joel played a key role in that conversation. I was like the sparks went off, you know. When we hear you say assurance of salvation, we think you're saying, you know, you pretty much got a guaranteed salvation. It doesn't really matter what you do with the rest of your life because you're in. And evangelicals will say, well, you know what, you don't think you quite understand us. And we went back and forth like that. And it was like, we wanted to celebrate, I think, at the end of that meeting. Because we got through a log jam. And now we want to find a methodology that helps the reader get through that log jam as well. So the point I want to leave you with is that ecumenical dialogue, bilateral conversations are a very enriching experience. And they're an enriching experience, many of you have had that experience on a local level or on a regional level or on a national level or on an international level. The difference between an international dialogue and a local dialogue isn't always that different. You know, you get the same dynamic is established, and the same spirit of reconciliation is created. And for those of you who are training to be theologians, think of ecumenical dialogues or conversations as a kind of a theological banquet. Right? You get to bring the riches of your own tradition. You get to share in the riches of the other tradition, and you get to put to test your deepest convictions and be enriched by that conversation. And it's always enriching. So if you find opportunities to serve in a dialogue, to participate in one, if you get asked by your church to sit on a dialogue, I invite you to seriously consider it. A lot of work. It takes away most of your free time. Beautiful experience, though, a very enriching and enlivening experience. So thanks for welcoming us here tonight.
Now it's time for your questions. Yes.
We just came from downstairs. We're a class. There's 16 of us. We're studying global Christianity. In 1965, at the time of Vatican II, both in the Catholic, Methodist, and the evangelical traditions, well over half of all those traditions were white Europeans, North Americans. Today, it's completely opposite. And I think our class, we study global Christianity, we're interested in that. How does that affect these dialogues, the demographic shift since that time? Does that have any impact on these traditions as they've all experienced almost turning upside down in their demographic composition?
Julia Fodder wanted to say something.
Perhaps I myself am South American. I think the dialogues itself are changing. There have been, from the Catholic point of view, from the Catholic Church point of view, the question was, where are the others? Latin Americans were always that problem. We were told about in many dialogues, but the theologians were not there. One of the problems was the language, and the other problem was the attitude of some churches from the two-third worlds regarding the ecumenism. But now I must say that there is no single commission without a theologian from one of that regions: Africa, Asia, and South America, I would say. This is one thing. The other problem, I think that is much more important, is to what extent the ecumenical dimension of the faith is being enriched in that regions. We must say that it's not yet, as it should. I'm talking for the Catholics, but I can say also for the evangelicals, from others. I would say Methodists also in some regions are not very sympathetic to ecumenism, because there is still a lot of wounds, and we are having that. So, officially, it happened a change. At the local level, I think we need to work more on that.
Anyone else from the dialogues want to respond?
I would fully agree, of course, that we have this shift of gravity in Christianity today. The question is, in terms of the two-thirds world, that these churches are not yet in a way organized to focus their voices according to the numbers and the weight they have in the Christian communion worldwide. They are not yet organized in such a way, and they didn't have developed, of course, a longer tradition of theology and of theologizing. And I think one of the very exciting perspectives of the 21st century will be how the voices of the South will be articulated on a worldwide international level. This is an open question right now.
I'd like to ask Father Juan to speak to his work with the Pentecostals.
I mean, in that global Christianity, perhaps the most interesting matter is the Pentecostalization of Christianity. So we are looking to a decreasing in numbers of the traditions, the theological traditions, but we are having a long numbers of Christians that are adopting Pentecostal spirituality or going to Pentecostal churches or having a Pentecostal experience. Every one of that is different, but that is affecting directly the face of Christianity at world level. In that sense, the Catholic Church is establishing a dialogue with the classical Pentecostals since '72. And now we are also having some dialogues with the new charismatic churches, neo-Pentecostals, and one of the movements, charismatic movements within the mainline churches, let us put this way. The question is, what is the role of Pentecostal churches and spirituality in the ecumenical world? In the past, they were not considered to be welcome and they do not want to enter. Now we must say that they are quite very much present in the Pentecostal world. They are arriving, but it's interesting that they are adopting the same structures as the others were adopting. They are learning how to talk to us, but we are losing sight of a new methodology, a new insight, and a new way of doing dialogue, and finding a way of trying to rebuild the church as it was created. I think the Pentecostal and evangelical side are really one of the most important topics we need to pay attention. Not only because there are problems, but I think there are sources of grace. We are looking at them as problems because we are having at times the experience of proselytism, aggressivity, not recognition, and that's a little bit harsh. But I think we need to cross the bridge and try to find them as sources of grace. Maybe one of the points that the three presenters were saying, and for me it's important, is, would you think, what is an evangelical? What is an evangelical? What is a Catholic? And what is a Christian? And what is a Pentecostal? Maybe that questions are necessary, because at times we divide Christianity, what is a Christian from what is your tradition, and that's a problem. And maybe that's part of a big part of the problem.
Karen, could I just add a little gloss from the perspective of the Methodist Catholic dialogue, that our present composition of the Joint Commission is more diverse globally than has ever been the case before. So we do have voices from Africa, Asia, Latin America as well. But this is part of a trajectory that needs to develop and move further, as Professor Hill has said. If I can illustrate a very positive development, has been with dialogue with the Anglican Communion, because historically the Church of England has dominated the voices of the Anglican Communion, and when the Church of England has spoken, the other Anglican churches around the world have fallen into line. But that is no longer the case. That the Church of England now is a part of a very diverse Anglican Communion, and so there are ecumenical possibilities that have opened up in different parts of the world with Anglicans that wouldn't have been possible before because of the dominance of the Church of England. So we find that, for example, in Ireland, that Anglican and Methodist relations in Ireland have been able to progress to a very advanced stage because of this changing nature of the composition of dialogues and ecumenism, and it's happening in other parts of the world as well. So it is having an effect, but it needs to accelerate.
I suppose just reflecting on that question in the context of a city like London, where we've got, the Catholic Church has about 45 ethnic chaplaincies. The English and Welsh Bishops' Conference now has dialogue with Black Pentecostals. That's a new dialogue. So there's an increased number of dialogue with different groupings than there was in the past. But also, say, within our own church, as Roman Catholic Church in London, we're actually, Brazilian Catholics might have very different customs and traditions from some of the English Catholics. So we're actually having to have some dialogue within our own church with different groups from different countries, and that raises many challenges. And also there might be greater fluidity on the part of some between churches. So in a sense, I think that dialogue internationally that can be reflected actually within the microcosm of a very small area, such as a city like London, and I'm sure in other cities as well.
Other questions?
So I'm not very well aware of like this cycle. So you said there's a reporting structure that happens to the World Methodist Council every 5 years. So is there an expectation that there will be some progress that will be reported, or is it simply this is what we have been doing and it's just an update kind of a thing? And when is the next Methodist Council?
The next World Methodist Council is in 2016, meeting in Houston, the end of August, so it's going to be rather warm, I guess. The intention has always been that we have to produce a substantial report on a theme that can reasonably be managed in the timescale available. So the reporting cycle, because it's tied to the meetings of the World Methodist Council, means that product is required. We can't just postpone delivery. So it makes this Methodist Roman Catholic dialogue quite unique in the international scene, in that we do have these fixed and periodic times. We have to ensure that a substantial report is produced, presented of course simultaneously to the Pontifical Council promoting Christian unity, and there is an expectation that if the dialogue is to be continued, then there has to be a product from it.
And a follow-up question, is there some sort of approval or affirmation of the report, or is there simply just is there some sort of like validation, like we agree, or?
That's a very useful question, because it reminds us, as Bishop Don has mentioned, of the problems of reception of the dialogues. What the World Methodist Council does is receive the reports. Now that might sound as though it's a fairly modest achievement to receive the reports, but I look, for example, at the Baptist Catholic International Conversations, when a report produced by those conversations 10 years ago wasn't even received by the Baptist World Alliance because there was so much sensitivity about it. It's very interesting that the World Methodist Council has been a very enthusiastic backer of the dialogue and has always done two things. It's received the report, it has then continued the dialogue, and more recently it's encouraged member churches to actually study the dialogues. And so this has happened, for example, the British Methodist Church has now taken to giving a formal response to the dialogue from its Faith and Order Committee, and we hope that other churches will do the same. For the Roman Catholic Church, it's a little bit different, and one of the Catholic members, I think, can explain what happens in the Pontifical Council. That's Tony.
Well, not having been there long, I don't know that that can be corrected. But what happens when the report comes in is we then will ask a theologian to write a commentary on the document. So that happens, and that is something which is that the document and the report are sent to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and the approval will be given for that document then to be placed on the Vatican website with the commentary. I think is that right, Don?
There's usually a status of the document,
Yeah.
saying this is the work of the Dialogue Commission.
Yes.
At this point, it is not the formal teaching received as the formal teaching of either the Roman Catholic Church or the World Methodist Council. But we put it forward for study by our community.
I think it's, at times is all the documents produced by the bilateral commissions are study documents and are documents to be criticized. So you have the right, you are invited to look at, to evaluate yourself as Christian if you are represented there, and to put your input. In that process, you are starting to dialogue yourself to the document. So it's an exercise, but at the end, the theologians, the members of the dialogue, needs to be call to humbleness because their result is not their result. It's a result offered to the churches, to the partners involved, to say yes or no. At times it's hard to hear a no. That means that we were not clear enough.
This changes the subject, but I was quite fascinated by your commentary on the method. It sounds intriguing and promising. I wonder if your method also includes the sharing of other aspects of faith. Some of the research on people's relationships across religious and theological difference suggests that people often are able to build more solid and respectful relations when they share their faith stories.
Frankly, but then you just get this opportunity, and I think really a lot of it had to do with sharing our faith stories and what was really important to me as far as, and not just important to me, but concern about my dialogue partner too, that, you know, our faith was really a key aspect of kind of opening up that dialogue. So to have that trust just doesn't happen overnight. But I think it's key. But I think what you said also is we want to reflect that then in the questions we're asking too. As Don said to me at one point, you know, what do you think, you know, we should be asking? How did we put it again? You know,
it's not just what we're encouraged by others, but
help me ask the question.
Yeah. Ask the dialogue partner for help in formulating the question I want to ask.
Yeah.
So that I can ask it in an intelligent, faithful way that doesn't have a little bit of ridicule or underlying suspicion in it. So
It really does help.
Can I just maybe respond to that as well? It's rather Bell would have said it, because one of the things that we were discussing in our drafting committee today was that, you know, we're reading through this report we've written, and it's very learned and inspiring in many ways, if you like that sort of thing. But one of the things that's very difficult to embed in a text is what I would call the kind of mess of the relationships we build. And it's true, it's about sharing our faith journey and giving our own sort of sense of ourselves. But one of the things, certainly I feel quite strongly when we were talking about, was the way in which things, really little things like, you know, we're all dislocated, we're all jet lagged, we're all tired, we drink wine together, we get tetchy with each other sometimes because we're tired and hungry, and we're all in a strange place, we're not sleeping properly. And actually the kind of embodiedness of that is one of the really crucial things which needs to be communicated when we talk about how this conversation happens. And I think one of the things we're working with now is how do we express that in the text. So we don't just talk about spiritual agreements and exchange of gifts, which is all very lovely, but actually how do we get real about that? And I think that's a real challenge, because for me that's really where it's at. So thank you for bringing that back to us. Question.
just add one piece. It's the things you mentioned and the things that Pope Francis likes to talk about as well, in terms of the primacy of building relations. Bilateral dialogues have a part to play in the reconciliation of churches, but it's one part. And it's the theological bilateral conversations have the role of looking at differences and trying to make progress on those differences. But even in doing that, we want to also share faith. But ideally, what you're describing is something that we desperately want to happen on every level of the church's life. And reconciliation among us is never going to be achieved simply by a document, no matter how beautiful. It's sometimes hard for us to think that because we love our documents so much, because we sweat so much. Every word is dissected, analyzed, criticized, reduced, you know. But still, it's only a document, and it's got to be the lived reality which draws us together.
So Eduardo, do you have something to add?
No, I think it's been well said. Yes.
Nelson?
To what extent would you say that this dialogue effort or these dialogue efforts in general are multi-generational?
I'm kind of guessing at what lies behind that question.
Oh no, it's actually more harmless. It's more harmless than it seems.
Well, I guess no, because even if it is in your head, I mean, there's a factual observation, which is that you are not, for all sorts of reasons. I have a limited experience of the dialogues at a couple of national, only one international, but on the whole, we are not the youngest generations in the church. You know, I mean, people in their 40s would, I think, be considered young. But I mean, this is our bit. You can stay young a lot longer as a Christian, it seems to me. You know, you can stay young right into your 40s. And I think, that there are reasons for that in terms, certainly, of you know who qualifies. You know, that people have to be established in their theological career or pastoral career before they really have a great deal to give. That's part of it. But for me, your question prompts a very serious question, which is to do with the question of reception that has been raised, which is how do we communicate what's going on in these dialogues to coming generations? Because although I don't believe in the whole language of ecumenical winter, I do think that the generation ahead of mine, who you know very often the kind of senior members of these dialogues, experience something very different ecumenically from my generation. And I can quite see why people, I'm 52, why people my age and younger don't quite get it, you know, what's the point of this? And I do think this presents us with a really urgent call to say, well, what are we actually doing here? And for myself, this is personal, I think there's actually something that we need to articulate about ecumenism as a practice, a spiritual practice, a practice of a discipline of conversation, a discipline of attentiveness, and a discipline of holiness, so that it becomes something which is just true to what it is to be a Christian, rather than some kind of added-on thing. I think it's only when we get that communicated that we're likely to see what a younger generation will do with this, because it won't necessarily be what we've been doing originally. But that's a bit bigger than your question.
And that's what I was pointing to, actually, kind of the disconnect among younger generations.
Yes. Yeah.
Next week, the new round of the United Methodist Roman Catholic dialogue, national dialogue, takes off. Both Edgardo and I are on that dialogue, but there's a person in the 30s. We represent 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s on that dialogue. It's a team of only 6 people. It's a pretty small group. And our focus is reception, so it's dealing precisely with the problem.
I think in the long run, of course, we have to compare the situation, let's say, after the Reformation of the 16th century and the centuries after, and this strong confessionalism we have had. And then the dramatic changes that happened after the Second Vatican Council. In my youth, for instance, in Germany, it was quite clear that Protestants and Catholics are on in different worlds. And today, a lot of progress has been made. So within 1 or 2 generations, a lot of things happened, and there is a good deal of progress. And it's not only an ecumenical dialogue that we have bilateral, it is also in the different churches. When I look through the biographies of my students, in many cases they have an ecumenical faith story from their parents. Perhaps one parent comes from the Catholic background, the other from the Protestant. Then they work for a period of time in the mainline church. Then they change to a free church, and so on. So it's a very different picture. Young people very often experience the membership and being shaped by different Christian organizations and denominations. So within their own biography, they have already an ecumenical perspective.
We have a question over here.
So ecumenical reception, the problem of ecumenical reception is not new with these dialogue groups. And I'm wondering at what point, if the problem of ecumenical reception has been with us as long as we've had bilateral dialogues, at what point do we wonder, is there something about the methodology that is modeled on a highly academic model? And at least in my experience with dialogue groups, all of the energy and passion and the genius goes into the document creation. And then people are tired. And it's sort of released into the air for someone else to receive, without always a great plan on the programs and the strategies and the events and the formative conversations that reflect the energy that you all are showing. So sort of beyond we've had a communal experience of convergence and reconciliation and identification of new questions to ask, and create a document. This is to the question about the lives, how this becomes interwoven in the lives of local congregations beyond sort of something posted on a website. That I'm wondering about what kind of questions you all are asking about the methodology of the bilateral dialogues.
Perhaps I think I agree with you, but to be honest, in the dialogue with the World Evangelical Alliance and the Catholic Church, the source of the second round was that the evangelicals came to us with a book saying, "A Roman Catholic Church, a contemporary reading from evangelical perspective." And they were so happy with that, and they gave us the book. And we start to read the book, and we say, that's not true. It's not okay. It's imprecise. It's absolutely unacceptable. It has been a lot of different levels of all the concepts that were made in a good faith, I must say, in a good faith. We say, maybe we need to clarify certain matters. The first meeting then come to the second meeting, and the second meeting we decided to have a phase of dialogue to clarify. So it has been also the other way around, at least in the World Evangelical Alliance Catholic Dialogue. The dialogue has been a response to the need to clarifying perceptions, and in this round, I must say, is a way of giving a sign to everyone that evangelicals and Catholics can be together, even though we do not understand each other, and at times it seems we hate each other because we are Catholics or we are evangelicals. So I do agree with your point, and I think we need to take that into consideration, but I do not want to dismiss the other part, that the dialogues as such are a response to a given situation that is a very likely one. In the actual round of the World Evangelical Alliance Catholic Church consultations, one of the problems is how to deal with all that portions of our communions that do not like us to talk. How to give that into the document. We are only 12 people. We try by asking them what they think about different matters. The responses given are responses that we need to treat with due respect, and we cannot throw it, because that will create more problems. But that has been an effort, I would say. I agree with everything you say, but this part of behind the scenes is important also to keep in mind. Because, if I may, I think the dialogues are important, but the new generations need to teach us what is the best way they can serve to the ecumenical movement. It's not the old ones to tell you what to do. That I will not like. But I think you need to teach us and to find a way and to open new horizons. There are horizons that we are not touching. and the new generations needs to touch and to teach also the dialogue members.
I would want to only add to that a couple of points. Certainly the documents that we produce are, if you will, only a portion of the work, presently a portion of the work and the work of God and the Holy Spirit that is active in that gathering of the dialogue. It's the easiest one to represent. It's very small, and I think its attainments so far are modest. I mean, many of us, if we're scholars, we are writing many things, and of writing books, there's no end, and you wonder how helpful this is. But there's an aspect of it, of this task that I see in that sense as kenotic, as self-emptying, understanding that this will not save the church, but that's okay, because we're not the saviors of the church. That's God, and so. But that what we're doing here is not without significance either.
No.
And that I see it. And this is just me. I mean, I do see it in that regard as seeds that are sown, and these documents as seeds. They sprout, and they're scattered, and they sprout in different places mysteriously. We do want to be. We are sensitive in talking in our dialogue group about matters of genre and how to make the documents more inviting and engaging in their approach, in their language, in the use of narrative, and incorporating narratives. So, for example, we're talking Grace and Holiness, narratives of Christian life, so as to be more engaging. But at the end of the day, it's still a document, and it will enjoy hopefully growing readership, but it'll still be a limited readership. And yet, I see it as a sign. A sign, and Christians are I think about signs, and God using and grace working through signs and symbols, and so that I suppose that is an aspect for me of the hope that keeps me anyway and engaged in this task, with the confidence that the results will be up to God and will be far greater than I could possibly imagine.
Bishop John?
I mean, one interesting aspect that gives me great encouragement is that where I live, about 25 miles outside London, we have members of the Focolare community. The Focolare, with founder Chiara Lubitsch, dedicated to reconciliation. Now, as an ecumenical community, where they have lifelong committed members of different churches who share their life together, and who are committed to reconciliation and that they may all be one, their outreach is really quite phenomenal across different generations, across ecumenical divides, and across inter-religious divides. Now, I think some of a movement like Focolare is actually building those narratives and relationships. Something like our document will inspire them, will encourage them. But I see their work as very complementary in actually shaping people who have this ecumenical outlook. So I suppose I'd want to say we need to look at the whole, try to see all the seeds that are sown in different places to get a grasp of what's actually happening on the ground.
So I went to a Wesleyan undergrad and college, and one of our best experiences was this week when a group of Franciscan friars came and stayed with us and just led worship and discussion groups and played ultimate frisbee with us and just ruined us. And put on they walked us through a mass and what everything means and how they're different. So I was just wondering, where does, Franciscan or otherwise, where does the monastic movement fit in with these conversations? And do they have a role in ecumenism, or are they just doing their own thing, or how do they fit in?
in the Catholic side, maybe it's us to need to talk. If you ask about there are members of the monastic communities that are theologians, part of the bilateral dialogues. Yes, there are, but it's not because they are from monastic life, but because they are invited to be part. I think it is important to have the roots, spiritual roots of the humanism. We need to recover. Not all the time we are doing that, but every time we are in a bilateral dialogue, we are a community of the spiritual humanism. I think we are theologians, and you can criticize the theology, and that's okay. You are entitled to. But you must remember that we are also, before that, we are baptized, and we are believers, and we are Christians, and at times some are do catechesis, other preachers, other priests, other nuns. So that's part of our faith. I think that as for the Catholic Church, one of the most interesting experiences is to interchanges between monastic communities from different traditions. And there are in Europe mostly, more than in America or in the South, there are different associations that are having meetings annually of monks and nuns that meet together to study some arguments, but also to share their spiritual lives. That's one of the issues. There are other experiences in the Catholic Church that are the communities that are open to other traditions. That's more specific, and they are about 5 in Europe. That are receiving there are Catholic communities, but they are having members, full members, that are not Catholics. That I would say is different, but there are some experience on that. In this year, we are having in the Catholic Church the year of the consecrated life, and as part of that, one of the key issues has been to invite nuns and monks from other traditions to talk about their experience as Christians, as nuns, as monks in a different setting of tradition.
Just added very few things to what Juan said. Yes, that start with where Juan finished. The Year of Consecrated Life, the conference in Rome, of which not only invited all of those religious from different Christian traditions. It was organised for the first day. There was Catholic Vespers the second day, and there was Orthodox Vespers the third day, and there was Vespers at the Anglican Church. And very consciously that they moved through what those different Christian traditions had to offer in terms of monastic life. Also within each day, the Vespers was just the end of the day kind of on worship. The Archbishop of Canterbury has invited Shaman Neuf to live at Lambeth Palace, and very much in the way that we've been talking about, shared life. The way we share life in our dialogue commissions is a way that Christians are really going to come together and grow and overcome the barriers. He's imagining that he's using that Shaman Neuf community to launch a much bigger community of young people coming and spending a year together, maybe about 30 I think is the idea. Shared life of prayer and mission and study. So from the traditional religious orders like Franciscans, like the Benedictines and others, and Jesuits, which actually do a huge amount carrying ecumenical progress for exactly the kind of week experience that you had, and people going to their houses and monasteries on retreat and having, sharing life and gaining enormously, to new Christian communities. So it also should be mentioned the Grey Friar, the Greymore Friars, who did so much and do so much to promote the week of prayer for Christian unity. to Chemin Neuf, Focolare, Bose community, and these are groups and Chef Tonya. These are religious traditions which are very much part of our council, but are doing a huge job in terms of the reception of taking the work we do to people and giving experiences which overcome a lot of the divisions between us.
So we've talked a lot about talking and about writing and about doctoring and about documents. And we've talked about younger people and how to engage younger people. I have met a lot of younger people who aren't as interested in talking and doctrine and documents. They're more interested in doing. So not that those things aren't doing, but they're interested in service, they're interested in justice. And so how can these ecumenical dialogues create atmospheres where different denominations and traditions can come together in common service, not just common belief or common worship or common prayer, but about common service? And I think that kind of initiative would reach younger people in a way that documents and doctrine maybe doesn't.
Can I tag on to because I was just writing down a question and you practically said what I was writing down. So I guess my version of that is, to what extent do practices factor into dialogue? And right now I'm thinking of, as a United Methodist, I'm thinking of the Catholic sacramental and the Methodist means of grace. I do recognize that sharing in sacramental communion is a sticky wicket right now. But are there practices that factor into dialogue? And I'm thinking of the infamous line in the preach always, and if necessary, use words. To what extent? So it could be justice, it could be a service, it could be, but certainly the notion of shared experience of jet lag, shared experience that contributes. So that's just my take on that. So I just want to tag down what you're saying and throw that to the group.
We used to do that in my church. We had a thing called Christmas in April, and we didn't check anybody's ID to make sure they were Lutheran or Catholic or whatever. But it was a very ecumenical approach where you did get to end up in conversations too about faith, as you're maybe taking a hermit's house and kind of rehabbing it and taking all this stuff out and everything. It's a pretty dirty job, but you ended up through that kind of service event, I guess, seeing that there are other Christians out there who care just as much as you do. And now that wasn't part of our dialogues per se, but I know we talked at some point about, at the end of the document, where do you go from here? And it isn't simply about just let's talk some more, but what can you do? And I think that would be a helpful component of any document, frankly, that works the work.
Jump from two directions. From the direction of churches wanting to engage in justice work, young people, older people, whoever. If we start to ask the question when we engage in a justice project, a mission or service project, can we do this with others? And if we can, should we do this with others? That needs to become, I think, instinctive for us or foundational for us. If we're really trying to serve the common good, we should be looking for other partners to work with us to do that. From the perspective of the dialogue documents, I think that they're not meant to collect dust in the library, and they're not just meant to work towards some kind of abstract reconciliation. Everything that we agree on should translate into action in terms of common witness, common mission, common prayer. There should be a direct relationship because we're meant to be together, right? We're not meant to be apart. And so it's not just up to the dialogue commissions to do that. I guess in response to the earlier question and this one, somehow our whole churches can't just load off the ecumenical task on certain groups and say, well, they're doing it. The doctrinal bodies of our churches should never be satisfied just saying, well, this is our criticism of this document, and we give it an 86, you know? It's like, these it's a generous, usually it should always be, how does this translate? How does this change our lives? What can we do together now that we couldn't do before? If the dialogue work isn't always expanding the common mission and common prayer, common witness spheres of our lives and drawing us more closely together, then it's incomplete and it's not in carrying out what it was intended to do. But that's the work of the whole church. I love the question.
Well, I guess I would jump off from that, and I'll speak from within the Catholic context. What kind of dialogue is happening inside the church so that the silo that you're in, Pontifical Council for Christian Unity, connects with the Pontifical Council for Culture, for Social Communications, for New Evangelization and Catechetics, etc. In the United States context, the Catholic bishops have issued a framework for the doctrinal elements of catechetical instruction for secondary students. And ecumenical and interreligious issues are combined in a single course that's listed as an elective, not as a mandatory course. And so I guess my question is, what do we need to do within our congregations so that what you learn in ecumenical dialogue by processing from the jet lag to the doctrine, to the prayer, how do we then do that across silos within our own congregations? Or what needs to change so that we can do that across silos within our own congregations?
I'll just throw out one starting point. It's that the whole church, all of our churches need to be converted to the basic notion that this ecumenical business, it's really Jesus' desire that we be one. And until our whole churches engage in that desire as a passionate desire, well, then it's a silo, right? And everybody else is happy to leave us in our silo. And when we can engage the whole church in that passionate search for reconciliation, then we can start making all kinds of connections to other activities. But it's the whole church's work to do that. One of our contributions to it is our documents.
But there's more. We need
there's
more.
There's got to be more. Yeah.
I think maybe it's an illusion to think that all the baptized will be an ecumenist, will be ecumenist. I think it will be boring. But it will not be an illusion to think that every baptized must have an ecumenical dimension of their faith. So it's not just everyone must be a preacher. No, there are somebody that need to hear. No one can sing. We need to have that ear to hear, to enjoy. And so I think that one of the challenge, and has been repeatedly say in different meetings and situations, is how we can give an ecumenical dimension. Those who are studying theology, if you study the church, you can study the ecclesiology from your own tradition. But when you add the other element about the ecumenical dimension of ecclesiology, you will have something more. Also of grace, also of authority. So, life. What is the ecumenical dimension of the Christian life? That I think is necessary to have. more than create ecumenists. I think that's something a little bit ideal.
One more question.
I do have one more question. It's a low-hanging fruit. To what extent does Pope Francis change things? Discuss amongst yourselves.
Well, you were saying, Bishop Don, the ut unum sint. Okay, until that becomes a focal point of all the Baptists, or at least on the radar, a recognition that there isn't a visceral, I'm going to walk out of this convention reaction. Okay? And right now I'm seeing reception, especially among youth, at, what is it? Forget who's it is from this part of the room. Pope isn't supposed to do that. That's an evangelical thing. So there's a sense, and again I'm speaking as a Methodist, a sense that something could be brewing. And that's exciting. It's like a birth. Okay? So to what extent, if even possible, does this change? It could be posture, it could be content, it could be topics, it could be, it's a very open-ended question. Maybe it's an idealistic one as well. But, so, yeah, anybody, please.
I'm probably not the best person, certainly not the best person, qualified person to speak on this, but I can offer one starting point. The very obvious thing about Pope Francis and his, what's driving his papacy is he's worried about all the people who are cut off behind barriers. Talking about the periphery, he talks about these term periphery a lot. We as Christians who are meant to take the gospel and the grace of Jesus to the ends of the world, ends of the earth, in fact, we don't go beyond these barriers, and there are a whole lot of people beyond there who are not getting the word and the grace of the sacraments that we're meant to take to them. And that's what really drives Pope Francis as a great concern. Where that comes together with ecumenical things is particularly in, I think, the South American context that he's coming from, is he sees this great and very negative competition between Pentecostal, evangelical groups and the Catholic Church. What's it called? Nobody's hearing the message of the gospel because we're too busy fighting amongst ourselves. They're just hearing the squabbling. The signal to noise ratio is too low, you could say. That makes sense, So Pope Francis, I think, in reaching out to evangelicals and Pentecostals in the way that he is doing, is really trying to overcome that competitive dynamic that's existed between the communities and say, look, we should just be worrying that there's people out there who are beyond a boundary and not hearing the message of the good news we're meant to take to them. And I think that's how he recasts, most fundamentally, the ecumenical relationship. And I think that's a very effective starting point. But others want lots more.
I suppose just one or two thoughts, just going back a step. The Synod on Evangelization with Pope Benedict, I often think one of the most remarkable events of that synod was that Archbishop Rowan Williams addressed all the Catholic bishops present. Now, that, I thought, he gave an incredible address about prayer and commitment and silence and action. So that was sort of stepping back. I know I was present because I was already in Rome for a meeting of teachers when Pope Francis was installed as Pope, and talking to the ecumenical visitors, they met him on day 2 of his papacy, and they felt really affirmed in a new way. So that, in a sense, was part of these gestures which Tony speaks, and there are others. So I suppose that, and then his particular friendship with the Pentecostal minister from Argentina who's killed on the motorbike accident. You know, these are very profound gestures, and I think that we need to watch these gestures because they're inviting a change in response.
If I may, he has not afraid to talk to those that most Catholics are afraid to talk. He has not afraid to do it publicly and privately. And he is encouraging all the Catholics to do it. He has not afraid to find new ways to reach the others and to announce the gospel. And he is doing. In the Catholic Pentecostal desk, one of the most difficult things is to convince the people that that's good. This time with him, I do not need. Because he is telling you in signs, gestures, symbols, expressions, and language. That. I would say that that was not the same language, gestures, symbols of the previous popes, but they were doing the same in a more theological language, symbols and gestures. But he is more effective on that because he is immediate. Something I would like also to say is, think about the first action he made when he was elected. This, for a Catholic that is not a charismatic, is a nice sign. You are praying for me. But that's the normal Pentecostal charismatic way of asking to the people to pray for the preacher before, in order that the preacher or the person that is presiding speak with the words of God, but leading by the Holy Spirit. So he is also aware of certain spirituality. He is not manipulating, but he is honest on that. He was using. So I think that on that sense, I must say, he is having a key role, as it was the role of Paul VI when he was given the ring from an Archbishop of Canterbury, as it was the role of John Paul II when he invited those who opened a holy door for the holy year of the year 2000. So there are elements. He is more immediate, and that's very good for us. Not to say that he is very interested on justice, peace, and he likes the theologians when we are clear with him, but he is not very much concentrated on that part, but he's giving room from the other 90% of the ecumenical movement that is important.
Thank you to the members of the dialogues for participating this evening. Thank you all for coming. There are more refreshments here. May the conversations continue. Thank you.